All right. Hey, everyone. I'm Amrith. I'm the moderator for today. I'm the tech policy reporter for the Wall Street Journal. My goal is to talk as little as possible and let you hear from our experts. This topic is super important. I think it's the best panel of the day. Personally, I'm a little biased, but it affects everyone. Everyone's using AI chatbots, and their impact on mental health and all of us is something that's really fascinating and something we all need to learn more about, frankly. So we'll start with intros and then dive into some topics. And then we're going to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. And I have a mic here that can be passed around. So, yeah, like I said, I'm Amrith. I'll do my intro first. Tech policy reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Write a lot about AI, chips, various topics. And yeah, really excited to be here. Amina, over to you.
Hi, my name is Amina Fazula. I'm head of tech policy advocacy at Common Sense Media. And I will just pass it over to Amanda.
Great, thanks. Hi, I'm Amanda Lenhart. I am a senior fellow at the Joan Gans Cooney Center at the Sesame Workshop, which for those who don't know is an innovation lab inside a Sesame Workshop. I just also want to say I don't speak for the Sesame creatives today, just for the center. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Adam Thier. I'm a senior fellow at the Art Street Institute here in Washington. I've been covering emerging technology policy here in town for 34 years now at a variety of different academic institutions and think tanks. Nice to be here again.
And I'm Shay Gardner, she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Policy and Research for LGBT Tech. If you don't know of us, we're a national nonprofit that fights for digital equity for members of the LGBTQ plus community. So thank you.
Cool. Before we get into policy and legal implications and what should be done here, let's start with just each of you. What's one or two trends? Like, what are the basic facts I should know about AI chatbot usage and how they're impacting mental health in different communities? And it can be a stat, it could be an anecdote, up to you, dealer's choice.
So Common Sense Media has been doing some research and also AI assessments into AI products. Our research team last year released research that showed that over 70% of teens were using advanced AI chatbots for companionship, and that about 50% of them were regular users, about 30% preferred engaging with the chatbot as much or more than other humans. We've also done research into sort of the awareness of parents into their children's AI usage, which you can guess is pretty low. And so I think that's some good ground setting to understand, yes, these products are used by kids. Yes, they're using it for AI companionship, not just to answer a question for school. And in addition to companionship, we're finding that there are often many questions related to mental health as well.
I'm going to go next. Thanks, Amina. As probably the researcher on the panel or one of the researchers on the panel, I actually did some of the work that Amina is talking about back when I was at Common Sense prior to joining the Joan Gans Cooney Center. And I actually want to dig a little deeper because I think some of the things that are coming up, Amina did a wonderful job of, I think, really setting the scene, and the data, that's really the best data that we have. It matches the Pew Research Center data that also shows a similar number of young people using AI companions. But I think we need to talk a little bit more about why they're using them and what they value. Young people tell us that a lot of times they're using these, which comes out in this data and some other data that we collected by doing open-ended questions with young people or focus groups with young people. And it's really often about talking about hard things. The frictionlessness of many of these companions is a huge part of their appeal. It's that it doesn't judge you. It's a place to try new things. And if you're an adolescent in particular, or a young person who is still learning how to be a human in the world, these companions are an incredibly powerful space. They also, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, stand in for therapy. For many young people who are unable to access traditional forms of therapy, they do stand in. Some young people tell us that this is actually okay and it's good and it's supportive. For others, it is a sort of poor facsimile of talking to a human. So I think there's a real sort of balance that we need to set here. So yeah, I think that the frictionlessness is what's important. There's also health information seeking that's happening. And that's problematic as well, because a lot of times young people don't know enough to know whether the information they're getting through these conversations with chatbots is accurate. So we have accuracy questions. We have questions around both why young people are using it, the sort of the stickiness of the tool, and also the ways in which it is mimicking human relationships for young people. They like it, but also I think we have to ask ourselves what that means for kids and their ability to create relationships with other adults and humans. So bigger questions, we can talk more about it, but I think I'll start there. Thanks.
Yeah, great. And speaking of bigger questions, I mentioned I've been involved in digital technology policy battles for a long, long time, but I've actually been involved in so-called media effects theory and debates going back even further into the analog age, and used to spend a lot of time, including at conferences like this one, debating things like video game violence and violence in movies and on television. And in every one of these debates, there's always a moment where there's a little bit of a moral panic or a techno panic about what's happening with youth and the new media of the day. And some of those concerns are completely legitimate. And I understand them all too well, having fathered two children who are digital natives, and they're fully grown now, but the struggle is real. But we also have to always make sure that we understand that there are many different forces and factors in play when you're talking about youth behavior and various types of influences that media might have on youth. I remember very distinctly, when I've been at 25 of the 26 State of the Net conferences, I was at one debating a former Army official who had written a book about video games called Stop Teaching Our Kids to Kill. And he said that video game platforms were turning our kids into murderous thugs, and he called video game consoles murder simulators. That was not that long ago. We had a huge fight about that. It happened here at this conference. Before that, I was involved in television and movie debates about violence and sex, many of which went all the way to the Supreme Court, very contentious issues. In each of these cases, I think we probably overestimated the effect of these different types of content and technologies on our youth. It doesn't mean there was no influence or effect. Absolutely, there can be. But every kid is different. Every household, every family is a little bit different. And it's challenging. And so people hear a lot about literature today and say it's a slam dunk. Kids are doomed. Chatbots are going to take our kids and turn them into monsters or hurt them in other ways. Well, I'll just give you two examples and then I'll shut up of like how there's a counter narrative out there if you look for it. I mean, here's two meta surveys, one that was done by Chang and 5 other scholars, public health scholars, about how youth use social media that concluded the findings of our study do not support the widely held view that adolescent technology use is a major causal factor in their mental health difficulties. And there's a meta survey of 46 different studies on social media use in mental health by Ferguson, Kay, Bell, and Markey in the Professional Psychology Journal that concludes they investigated in this meta-analysis that the results indicate the current pool of research is unable to support claims of harmful effects for social media youth on youth internalizing disorders. That's not to say that there are no problems. It's just to say that there is another part of this story. I happen to be a big believer in the idea of resilience and the idea that kids can somehow muddle through with the help of adults and their families, but not all can do it equally. They need help, they need education, they need literacy, they need understanding. When I wrote a book about these issues and served on 5 different online safety task forces between 1999 and 2010, including one where I was a co-chair for the Obama administration of a task force called OSTWIG, Online Safety Technical Working Group, I always come back to the same line in the conclusion of every one of my reports, that at the end of the day, there are no silver bullet solutions. We just always must talk to our kids in an open, loving, and understanding fashion about the realities of this world, including the difficult things that new technologies present us with.
Yeah, I love that last sentence. I think this question actually gets to the core of a lot of the policy work that we do at LGBT Tech, which is grounded in the reality that members of the LGBTQ plus community go to digital platforms and spaces seeking supplements for things that are not available to them in the real world. That is only getting worse in this current political environment. And when we look at chatbots and synthetic companions in particular, something we're seeing is that this is not an exception to the rule. Actually, it's probably the perfect example of it, right? It speaks to the sort of, I think, two truths of this situation. You spoke about a balance earlier. I know we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this tightrope, this gray area, and how we should be navigating it. But there are two truths to be held here, right? One is that AI companions are not mental health tools, right? Like they are not mental health care. The other truth is they are being treated as mental health support, particularly by members of vulnerable communities like those within the LGBTQ plus community who really increasingly do not have access to that anywhere else. So I know as we have this important conversation today and it continues to happen in this room and outside of it, just keeping that in mind where there is again, no silver bullet solutions. You said it better than I could, but recognizing that it's not going to land on one side or the other. We've got to do our best to try to find this middle ground that supports people who are desperately in need of the care they're seeking on these platforms.
That segues nicely. It seems every day a new state proposes a AI chatbot bill. We'll see. There's been some proposed in Congress. So, like, what do you guys think as far as what are some of the principles, or like what are you seeing that is promising, and maybe some other things that you're maybe concerned about in these bills, and what can we take away from that?
Yeah. And so I think one of the things that maybe slightly stepping to the side of this diving into policy question is efficacy of these tools. So if we know kids are using advanced chatbots as either companionship or for mental health support, even though they're not built for that, how good are they at that task? And our assessments have found that advanced chatbots, LLMs, are particularly bad at identifying users in crisis. So these are tools that are particularly bad for the task at hand. And so I think that is what is driving a lot of the conversation by policymakers, because, as my panelists have pointed out, there is a deep need for mental health support. About 20% of teens suffer from some DSM-related mental health illness. And what we found in our assessments is that while advanced chatbots are improving at potentially doing a redirect when common language is used to identify a crisis like suicide or self-harm, for a whole host of other mental health illnesses, there is not that same level of immediate intervention to a human or to an appropriate person for that crisis. So we're seeing across the country a lot of baseline efforts to, one, remind all users, not just children, that they're talking to a chatbot. This is in part driven by the fact that advanced chatbots often pretend to be a person. They use pronouns, they refer to their own illnesses or their own backstory, things that just don't exist, which give users the impression that they're talking to another person. So those baseline reminders, which many in the industry are already applying, are things that are now being codified. In the worst case scenarios for suicide and self-harm, we're seeing requirements, again, a codification of a mental health redirect in those types of instances. And then we're starting to see some baseline approaches to trying to understand how often that's happening. So that's what we saw in the California bill. So some amount of data gathering, how frequently are these advanced chatbots being required to direct somebody in an instance of suicide and self-harm? I think what's missing there, while these are all laudable and important efforts, I think is any prevention of harm. So by the time a user has been led to crisis, there really isn't anything in those types of policies to prevent that leading to crisis. And I think those are the sort of tricky, thorny issues of how do you develop a policy that not only responds in the worst case scenarios, does some data gathering of when that happens, does some basic transparency and notification to users that you're in fact talking to a chatbot, but then also does the work of preventing the harms that we're starting to see.
Thank you, Amina. That's, I think, great. I would like to step back a second and talk about maybe some other ways to think about some of the conversations we've been having about research and its impact and how we then use that as we think about policy. So recently, of all places, Consumer Reports has put out a really interesting piece of writing that pulls on the research of Nate Matias and Amy Orban, who are two really wonderful researchers at Cornell and Cambridge, who are putting forth this idea of bad if true. Because a lot of what we talk about is like, we don't have great data about what's going on. These technologies are really new. How do we think about them? And so what Amy and Nate have been talking about pulls actually from chemical regulation, which is a lot of times chemicals are being used in sort of corporate environments and something bad happens. There's an accident, somebody gets burned, something terrible happens. And we then know that maybe there's actually something kind of bad with these chemicals, but we don't necessarily know specifically. Oh, we haven't done the research. We haven't tested it on mice. We haven't tested it on human skin, but we have a sense that, oh, actually, maybe something's not great here. So everybody in the community is put on notice that like we have a sense that something is not good here. I think, and really for Nate and Amy, this is drawing from this huge outcry that we have from parents, right? Parents are worried about the impacts of these tools on their kids. They see stuff. This is really coming out of social media, but I think generative AI, as more and more kids use it over longer periods of time, are beginning to scratch at some of these challenges as well. And so I think what this framework gives us is it says we don't have to wait for the research to be perfect. We know, we put ourselves on notice. We can then design around, so designers, companies, parents, families can start designing their lives around certain things that they think might be problematic. And then the researchers can go in and target their work to try to answer those questions more quickly. So I think that's might be a helpful framework for us as we start to think about, hey, like, where should we be targeting some of our regulatory lenses as we're thinking about, we can start to see some of these problems. We're starting to see hints of problems with chatbots. And in particular, I think starting to think about how we might design chatbots to get away from some of the beginnings of harms that we're starting to see. And I don't know whether we want to write this into regulation, if we want to start thinking about this, but some things that are beginning to come out both anecdotally and in early research, suggest that young people move from, they're not just using purpose-built AI for companionship, they're actually doing homework and hanging out, and then maybe something comes to mind and they ask the chatbot a personal question, and they sort of swing back and forth between sort of utilitarian uses and personal emotional uses, particularly of large language models. So the idea that somehow we can wall off doing homework from having personal conversations with your chatbot, I think is impossible. So we have to have that lens over what we're looking at. I think also something that Amina hinted at is that the longer you use a chatbot, the more the guardrails get soft. So if you have really long conversations that continue, that's where things start to fall apart. So the things that are already in place, and again, part of this is because we don't really understand what's happening inside the black box of this technology. The guardrails get soft. They don't work very well. And that puts users, particularly those who talk for a really long time with these chatbots, at risk. Now, I know there's been suggestions that we need to pop up, we need to tell people. There's actually really good research from other disciplines that suggests that pop-ups aren't actually that effective. People stop seeing them pretty quickly. So I think one of the things that I'm starting to hear about is maybe we need to start asking these platforms to stop having a human-like voice. Go back to sounding like a computer so that every single time we interact with them, we know that we're talking with a machine and not a human-like entity that makes us feel really good and like, I'm the best. Oh, you think my idea is wonderful? Thanks, ChatGPT. So I think we need to move away from the things that pull especially children, but all of us, into these effective relationships with these tools and keep it much more above board. So these are some of the things. I also I think we need to get to a point we've seen over the years that like, we've had 20 years of looking at social media platforms not being able to like really make meaningful, like concrete changes to really help children have better experiences in these spaces. And I think these are complex things, as Adam has said. I don't want to get into moral panics, but I don't think we're in a self-regulation space. I think we need to force people to make better choices because the incentives in the market are not aligned with keeping children healthy.
So when we look at the policy landscape for what's going to happen with AI chatbots this year and next, it's really, really hard to even track this anymore. I mean, the sheer volume of AI legislation at the state level has become overwhelming. One tracking service, Multi-State AI, has a total on the online as of this morning, 1,289 bills already introduced to the United States in just a few weeks into this year. It's an astonishing number. Other tracking services have different numbers because it's a very, very difficult definitional question about what is AI and then what are all its subcomponents. And that is also reflected in the fact that when you get into the question of chatbot policy, there are different counts depending on how you define a chatbot. And of course, there's a lot of chatbot bills that just are focused on mental health therapy chatbots. Illinois, Nevada passed bans, many other states entertaining them. So what we have is a subset of a subset, and we have patchworks on top of patchworks. So it makes studying this issue and analyzing it and trying to track it extraordinarily challenging. That being said, there are a lot of regulatory and governance frameworks out there for AI generally and for chatbots in particular. Let's think about the spectrum very briefly so that we can have a more focused discussion. And as we do, let's keep in mind what the First Amendment commands us to do in this country, which is always to seek out the so-called least restrictive means of addressing concerns related to these matters. because the First Amendment creates a high bar for government regulation of things that implicate speech. So what would be the less restrictive means approach to chatbot regulation? Well, it would start with something focused on education and literacy related efforts, something that has been part of the toolkit we've proposed for many, many years for many different types of platforms. It can't be the only solution, but everyone agrees it should be part of it. And there's a lot of legislation out there that proposes at federal, state, and local level. Challenging to do. Always have to figure out how to go about digital literacy and things like that in education when the technology is constantly moving as fast, especially as the new ones are. But that would definitely be completely kosher with regards to First Amendment. The next would be disclosure, moving up on the spectrum of restricted. The next would be disclosure and transparency requirements. And this is what, of course, is in a lot of the legislation that's already passed or that's pending right now. And generally speaking, I'm willing to give a lot on this. Other people are a little bit more sticklers about like how far should we go with government mandated restrictions or disclosure or transparency. The devil's in the details, but clearly that could be part of the solution. And it has been in the past for various things. The problem is that will government define what you have to disclose? Will they actually try to then use it as a regulatory hook? This came up in the video game context I talked about, where the government tried to co-opt private rating systems to basically become a regulatory hook for restricting their sale. Can't do that, the Supreme Court said, in a case having to do with California trying to regulate video games. But that being said, there still could be some de minimis transparency disclosure requirements that could work potentially. Well, then we get into the harder things. You start talking about age assurance versus age verification. And of course, there's going to be a whole other discussion or panel about this, so I won't go into it in detail. This is something that has been with us for a long time. Going back to the mid-90s and the fights about COPA and other types of regulations, COPA and COPPA, about how do you determine age and how do you go about regulating or mandating things. You have to be very, very careful with this because it can be very privacy intrusive, security problematic, and First Amendment violating. So you have to really think about how to do that. Age verification and age assurance are separate things. We need to talk about them separately, but I won't get into that detail unless we want to. Okay, let's get into the really sticky stuff briefly, and then I'll shut up. Duty of care and duty of loyalty. These concepts are well-intentioned. They sound great in theory. The problem is we live in a highly litigious society where very open-ended, ambiguous terms like duty of care or loyalty can lead to a hell of a lot of liability, which ultimately does not solve as many problems as it creates. So we have to be extraordinarily careful about how we do these things. We have very narrowly tailored these types of duties in the past in very specific professions under the name fiduciary obligations and other types of legal concepts. We need to be very careful about it in this context because it could lead to a lot of indirect regulation through the courts, because if there's one thing America doesn't lack, it's lawsuits and trial lawyers. So you have to be very careful about that. And then, of course, you get to the most problematic of them all, which would be flat bans on chatbots, right? We already see it with mental health therapy chatbots. These things are going to be challenged. I'm working with people who are trying to file suits against these types of laws. Generally speaking, bans are never the best answer, and they're going to be viewed as constitutional eventually anyway. So you're going to spend a lot of time in the courts fighting about something that we shouldn't be fighting about at all. We should start with those least restrictive approaches first, work our way up, and then be very careful as we get to the top of the more restrictive mechanisms.
So our approach on this has really been to try to identify these kind of different areas of risk factors or pain points rather than treating chatbots as like this monolithic tool that should either be approved or banned in its entirety. So I think that the first one of those very obviously is this world of emotional manipulation, right? That feeds into the sycophancy of it all. That feeds into some of the anthropomorphism that we tend to give to these tools and the parasocial relationships that come from those. That actually feeds into the second area that we are very closely watching, which is disclosures, which you brought up as well. Those are incredibly valuable in just raking through all of that emotional manipulation I mentioned, but we have to be very careful not to hit the point of fatigue where folks are completely ignoring them. This is where something I've not heard too much discussion on, but I'm very hopeful about. Our third risk area here is really around data privacy. We see young people and adults alike going to these chatbots and providing just the most personal information possible about themselves. Obviously, I'm speaking about the LGBTQ plus community. I'm speaking about identity and sexuality and experiences. At the same time, that could also apply to anyone on these platforms searching healthcare, mental health support, anything really. And if folks are having this conversation in a way that they feel is protected without an understanding of the fact that currently it is not, that could be very, very dangerous down the line. So I bring up data privacy directly after disclosures because it's part of the conversation I'd like to see more is I would love for that to actually be weaved into the larger conversation of disclosures. Let people know not only are you speaking to a tool, to a digital tool, not to a human, but just so you know, these are your data privacy rights or lack thereof once you're having this conversation with it. Let young people know that off the bat in the same way that if they were to go into a therapist's office, they have some sort of interpretation of where their privacy might lie in those conversations. Give them that same opportunity with those chatbots. And then finally, research. I think it'll be a common theme up here, and we can never have too much of it. Something I find very interesting is when this research actually tries to get to the core of the issue of why these tools are being leaned on for so much mental health support and therapeutic support. These are people that in many cases are self-triaging. So I think figuring out what research that asks the question, not only what are you doing on these platforms, are they harming you, but also is asking what are they replacing for you? What is it that you're missing in the grander scheme of things is a really good way down the line to make sure that we are not solving for this symptom, right, rather than the disease itself.
Fascinating stuff. You guys maybe started getting into this, but are you operating in a world where the federal government doesn't do much on this topic with social media and many other tech policy issues? And does that mean we should expect then just these state rules and companies have to figure out how to comply, and the Trump administration doesn't like a lot of these states and has this executive order out there? Is that the dynamic we're going to be looking at for the foreseeable future while this technology evolves and gets more powerful by the day?
I think there has been an opportunity to develop bipartisan interest and an actual movement on really fine-tuned safety measures around AI. There's really only one example of that thus far. And otherwise, what we've heard a lot of is first a moratorium and then preemption efforts. Now with the AI executive order, there is now a wholesale review being done of state policies and potentially a punitive approach to states by withholding certain federal funding. So look at those tea leaves. It doesn't appear that there's like really consistent appetite for the federal government to take steps on AI safety. However, we have seen bipartisan introduction of AI safety bills. I agree with the concept that privacy is an important piece, but I think the other piece that's missing is just, and this might seem really at a base level, but just understanding the liability of the AI companies when they cause harm, whether or not we're talking about kids or chatbots, but just where is the redress for users of AI? And Senators Hawley and Durbin have taken, I think, early steps with, I think it's Lead on AI Act. That's a very fundamental piece that I think needs to be clearly defined and answered. And then building on top of that, I think also a good role for the federal government would be to protect specifically privacy of user inputs when it comes to AI. I think there's a whole host of information that isn't categorized in our traditional privacy law definition. So it's well beyond PII or personal identifiable information. It's well beyond personal information. I think the types of information that kids especially are given to advanced chatbots can talk about themselves, their parents, others. It can talk about immigration concerns. It can talk about sexual exploration, gender concerns, a whole host of incredibly, I think, controversial potentially and incredibly private topics with very little privacy protection or none. And so that I think is particularly concerning as, right now we've got, about 55 million plus students across the United States now gearing up to use advanced chatbots in schools or at home in relation to educational uses. But as our colleagues have pointed out, they often veer into the personal very quickly with no real privacy protections in place. So that I think is incredibly concerning. And this is a fast-moving space. Since we started doing this research on AI and now advanced chatbots. At one point, we were talking about social companions. It keeps on blurring. And so just the pace of change, I think, should give anyone at the federal level pause on anything that looks like a preemption or moratorium, because we're going to need every cop on the beat to keep track of where the harms lie and what a good approach could look like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty pessimistic about any sort of regulatory action happening absolutely at the federal level. And at the state level, it's also much more complicated. As Adam has mentioned, it does create a problematic patchwork for companies to try to navigate, even though they are, frankly, navigating global patchwork of regulation. So I always step back and I'm like, this is a challenge that needs to be addressed holistically. Yes, regulation is one piece of the puzzle, and we should push forward on that. Also, particularly regulations that actually help us with that broader puzzle are super helpful. So even things that just mandate literacy education in schools across the country, in every school. There's a lot of schools that don't mandate it. There's no reason to do it. There's no guardrails or no parameters around the kind of education we need to be doing with kids. So we need to support children in this space. We need to support parents in this space. We need regulators to attempt to enact things, and we need companies to make change. Some of the ways that we're pushing to make change from companies is through legal action. That seems to me right now to be the place where there is more traction happening, less at the regulatory level. States might have a chance to do some things, and I would encourage them to think about not just how can I regulate this specific technology, but how can I support parents? How can I support children? How can I support this whole ecosystem? How can I support educators? How can I help with education systems in my state and help them do a better job of deciding how or how not to have these tools in a classroom or not? Those are the kinds of sort of a broad-based approach I think we absolutely need to be taking if we actually want to do anything. And to be clear, there's urgency. I have a 13-year-old who's my youngest child, and she's living this right now, like right now. I'm going to go talk to the middle school PTA tomorrow. There are a bunch of parents, hundreds of parents who are going to be on that call who are living this right now. So the more we can do to accelerate on whatever front we have, I think we owe it to ourselves to try to do that.
So comprehensive technology policy in the United States of America is now a losing proposition. Period, full stop. It is just not possible anymore. Narrowly drawn technology policy is possible. We found that out with the Take It Down Act. You can take a narrow approach for a very specific problem. You can get consensus and bipartisan agreement on it. But honestly, when was the last time a big bill passed? And you can take a look at the privacy experience with ADPPA and APRA and find that out. But I could cite a litany of other examples. Driverless car legislation, among many others, and now AI policy. You just can't build a consensus. So that's really, I think, unfortunate. In fact, it's the number one thing that's changed in the 34 years I've been covering technology policy in this town, is that we've seen a complete role reversal of who leads on technology policy, digital technology policy, from the federal government to the states. We're celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 passing yesterday, a bill that very much shifted the debate about federal-state jurisdictional relationships to the federal level and tried to create a more national framework, along with the Clinton administration and its framework for global electronic commerce. A very intentional effort to get away from regionalized regulation, state-based regulation of telecommunications and media. And now we're reversing it all. Huge mistake in my opinion, but that doesn't mean it's going to change anything. The reality is that we're now stuck with a patchwork of a patchwork of a patchwork. Many different standards, as I mentioned. And in that environment, we're going to have a couple of key states really driving the conversation. And of course, it's primarily going to be California and New York. And so we're going to be stuck with this very confusing situation where a lot of people talk about this being about states' rights and federalism and devolution and laboratories of democracy. But the reality on the ground is that whatever Sacramento and Albany dictate is probably going to be the law of the land. And what it's going to force is a conversation at the federal level about the best they can do being, let's just basically federalize whatever Gavin Newsom and Kathy Hochul have already passed. Which is terrifically, just deliciously ironic. The Republican Congress is going to be put in a position where they're going to say, Gavin Newsom, what should we do on tech policy? But that's where we're at right now. And I think that's what's going to happen with a lot of the child safety stuff. Because obviously we've had COSA pending for how many years now? We've had all these other issues pending for how many years? Decades in some cases. It doesn't happen. But at some point, the costs and confusion associated with this patchwork from hell, again, 1,200, almost 1,300 bills. That's unprecedented. This isn't just about cost to innovators. It's about costs and confusion for consumers and households and parents. This cannot possibly be the way we do technology policy for things that are national and even global in character. And yet we're often running with it, so much so that my latest article on this in Law 360 this week is called Rise of the AI Articles of Confederation. We're living in a new world now. And even though the Constitution should have something to say, and Congress should, about interstate commerce and confusing standards among the states, unfortunately, we're not getting it.
For fear of repeating what's been set up here by my colleagues, the only piece I'll add to this conversation now is actually the enforcement conversation around this. Who gets to decide whether the experience or the exposure a young person is having on these chatbots is innocuous or is inappropriate, is harmful, is obscene? My favorite word in my policy work. That is going to make a huge difference on what is or isn't allowed to be presented to them in those conversations. This is a statement I find myself saying a lot. It matters here just as much as anywhere else. If they say it about gender affirming care, they will say it about gender affirming content. And if you're not worried about FTC enforcement yet, I encourage you to go look at what they said about gender affirming care on July 9th.
Wow. All right. We're ready to take your questions. So who has them? All right.
What a great panel. Thank you all very much for a thorough discussion of the issues. There's one you didn't get to, and I want to raise it. There have been a number of lawsuits filed by families of teens who have killed themselves or harmed themselves. Some of them have been settled. Some of them are still ongoing. The theory is product liability, that the companies did not design a product that was safe for its foreseeable use. What do you think about that as a control mechanism for making sure the companies behave responsibly?
I think it's important in this sort of early stage that all pathways to redress are still open. One, it helps all of us understand the real world instances of harm, which are hard to surface. It takes a lot of effort for a family to actually bring a case, choose to decide to do all of that. And tech cases are always really daunting, especially when it comes to the evidence. And again, as we said earlier, parents are often in the dark about their children's tech usage, especially when it comes to a one-on-one engagement with AI chatbot. So I think it's important because it helps us look at how some of the harms are actually emerging. In terms of the impact on companies, I think it's hard to say. I think the communications pushback that happens because these cases are covered, because they start to impact the public's perception, I think there's this sort of beyond whether or not the case goes forward or it gets settled or what happens at the outcome, I think there's this follow-on effect for a short period of time, depending on the attention span of the American public, that companies will feel some heat just from those cases being filed and covered. But when settlement occurs, which is completely possible depending on the details of the case or the victims themselves and their decision, it's unlikely to have a long-term impact on the technology. And then again, you're relying on the details of a particular case. One, to have the right evidence in place, hopefully enough money to keep those high-powered lawyers in place, and then make it all the way through the courts. And that's not really a great way to make change in terms of policy and in terms of widespread improvement for the industry as a whole. Because again, these cases are often about one experience on one product. So while I think it's really important and has, I think, incredible benefits for all of us who are thinking about policy solutions, I think that it's probably not the primary way we're going to see change or even industry-wide change.
I just want to add one thing to that, which is I think it is a piece of a broader approach. It's slow, as I think Amina has said. The one thing that I also want to emphasize, though, is that sometimes it's a little bit how we break down some information asymmetry between the public and companies, because through the discovery process, things get revealed and shared that help us to better understand what's happening behind the scenes and frankly, shine a light on some of the pretty cavalier approaches that some of these platforms have taken to I mean, I saw some stuff that was at a conference that was revealed through discovery, and I could not believe how juvenile and frankly thoughtless some of the guardrailing parameters were that we saw. So I do think things like that do help us understand where companies are putting time and money and priorities, and might be able to help shift, even if that just helps them to avoid uncomfortable conversations and press coverage in the future.
Just a really brief answer. Lawsuits present a lot of challenging questions about the applicability of product liability law to speech-related matters, something that raises some real sensitivity, because there are some obvious questions about the collision with the First Amendment and Section 230 and things like that. But just generally speaking, product liability in the physical, tangible space of safety is a different thing than intangible and speech-related safety. Second of all, and just to close on this point, if some of these cases move forward, it's obviously going to open up just an absolute avalanche of lawsuit activity in the search for deep-pocketed defendants, and I don't think that helps anybody. It's also going to take many years for these things to play out in the courts. Not clear to me how that really helps, but this could end up creating a huge constitutional challenge and also lead back to a question about like reopening liability standards for the AI era, but I don't think that's going to go the way industry wants it to go if it happens in Congress.
I don't want to stop Shay, but when you're done, can we come back to the First Amendment stuff? I'd love to just have a chat about that.
Yeah, I was just going to say the lawsuits are likely not going to move the policy needle far enough into the direction that we wish it would. Said I would encourage industry not to dismiss the reputational damage of situations like these. It's internally, and for those that work in the space, you may know that this is one horrendous outcome out of a million positive outcomes. Internally, that may be known, but it really only takes a couple of headlines, I think, to see the damage that will do. Always, when I think about these lawsuits and see these headlines, it actually makes me think about the rollout of autonomous vehicles, self-driving vehicles, where there was so much work going on behind the scenes, but then there were a few headlines about one company, and I don't know that industry ever recovered.
Let's go. I think I saw you next in the middle right here.
Good morning. First and foremost, excellent panel, great job, and kudos to you all really leading policymaking in this space. So thank you for the work that you're doing. I'm a mental health practitioner. I'm also working on the Hill, currently writing health policy in the intersection of tech and mental health. We've heard about policy, we've heard about research. I'm curious if you could share about practice and share a little bit about what practitioners are actually saying on how they're integrating some of these tools, mental health spaces, and what are some of the feedback that you've been getting on that end?
Yeah, I would suggest take a look at the work of Data and Society Research Institute, a place I'm an affiliate of. Olivia Garofalo leads the work there, where they've done interviews with mental health practitioners about the experience of co-practice with AI. And they're also now doing additional work on the experience of people using AI for mental health. Adults. It's work with adults. It's not with children. They actually just did a comment to the FDA, which they made public on their website, which I commend to all of you. It's a good run through of their current research and then the positions that they're taking, which is essentially, if people are using it as a mental health tool, then it probably needs to be regulated like a mental health tool, even if the people who design it say that it's not. But worth looking at just for their research walkthrough, in particular, even if you don't necessarily agree with their outcomes.
And then I would just add, when it comes to practitioners using these tools, it's good to remember the privacy implications of using these tools. So if you're using an advanced chatbot alongside confidential conversation where you have a certain type of duty of loyalty and expectation of privacy, those two things might not align. So purpose-built tools, I think, are a different conversation from using on-the-shelf LLMs and advanced chatbots.
Seconded, if those tools are being introduced without any sort of cybersecurity infrastructure, you're setting yourself up for failure. I can't believe no one has said, I don't think anyone said safety by design, but it's something we've seen is that a lot of folks still really are lacking that very basic data security infrastructure. That's a whole other panel talking about data minimization, deleting chat logs, how to protect yourself there, but especially if you're using this in a healthcare therapeutic setting.
Yeah, let's keep moving so we can get to a few more.
Very quickly, I also recommend the Connected Health Initiative, and AMA has some work that we've all been doing on this. I'm going to actually keep with this theme. I was going to go in a different direction, but it raises a great point. One of the things that we're dealing with in the healthcare space around AI is, if you think about it, when you usually visit the emergency room, you're under stress. You are not always making your best decisions. So what a lot of patients are wanting to doing, especially patients with significant chronic issues, is built an agent that has their likely desires. especially for mental health when you're under stress. And they want to use it to inform the physician. Instead of being stressed, high heart rate, out of control, the agent says, in a normal situation, this patient would like this treatment or would like this care. What we're dealing with is the liability of what that looks like. How do I have an agent act on behalf of me as a patient? Also, we have to think about it in payment models as well. But for all of you, you've been talking about a lot about liability. You've been talking about the business liability. The flip side is, it's not a bad idea to have the calm version of you answer the doctor in a time of stress. So how do you think that works in terms of what we've all been talking about?
My sense is with all these AI, the best solution is to narrow. The more you are working with a large model that's been trained on everything, that is being hoovering up the data to retrain and retrain, that is, I think, where you open yourself up to liability. When you're entering the personal data of a person, a PII of a person into a system where it can be then fed back out to an unsuspecting person, that's where you end up with these challenges. So I think the more you create a product that is trained on a very tight corpus where you're not using the data to retrain, I think you can set up ways in which you design the product that you build or that patients build for themselves. I mean, I love that. I love that in terms of like patient advocacy. It's a beautiful thing, but we have to do it in a way that limits. It's got to be data minimized. I got to have very tight parameters in order to be functional.
And if I can add to that, I will admit I know little about the healthcare setting, so I may not know how to implement this perfectly, but something we're seeing increasingly in AI legislation that we think is fantastic is a human right of review, building that into the process, where if an AI is either recommending or making a consequential decision that will impact a user, that user would then have the ability to request human eyes on that decision process. So I would imagine that, again, not exactly sure how to implement that transparently, but building some sort of stopgap in there in situations like these potentially allows for that sort of assistance and care without it entirely having to be run through that.
And in addition to privacy, I think for these types of scenarios, you want something high degree of efficacy. And I think all of that just follows, I think, the advice that Amanda's giving, which is you've got to be incredibly narrow and careful so that you're actually getting the outcomes that you're seeking. Right now, there's this sort of a lot of hype around promise in a quick shortcut to a tool. And then we move to, 50% of the time it works the way I say it should, or 60% of the time. So if you're in a healthcare scenario where you're talking about somebody walking into the emergency room representing them, you're going to want it to work exactly the way they expect it to work.
No hallucinating.
Yeah.
No hallucinations.
Maybe one last question.
I know we just have a minute, but I wanted to ask Amina if you could chat a bit about CSM's ballot initiative that you've proposed in California. I saw this started out really broad, and then OpenAI came in and proposed its own ballot initiative that was effectively designed to kill yours. And now you guys have teamed up together and have a joint initiative. So I would love to hear a bit about that process, how that partnership came about, and what you see in the value of a ballot initiative over something like a law.
I'm not part of the ballot initiative team, so I can't really speak to all the nitty-gritty details, the back and forth. However, one thing that you see in that sort of remains true across the Common Sense Media ballot initiative, and if you look at the text of what the new partnership ballot initiative includes, is a combination of factors. You've got privacy, you've got elements around age assurance, you've got elements around risk-based audits or audits requirements, and in elements around safety and enforcement. And we're seeing those elements again in legislation in other states as well. And it's something that we actually haven't talked a lot about today, which is this sort of assessments piece, which is a fundamental piece that I think is missing right now. The EU AI Act has created a space for risk-based assessments, categories around high risk. In the United States, NIST has not really gone so far. In the last administration and this administration, I think that's a missing piece. And so we're starting to see that come up at the state level. Another interesting place where you're seeing a conversation around assessments and pre-deployment, like safety requirements, is also in Utah, where there's a baseline approach to trying to look at what are the sort of requirements around assessments and transparency, whistleblower protections, things like that. Though I don't believe that's included in the ballot initiative. So I'm starting to veer into other topics.
All right. I think unfortunately we're out of time, but feel free to come up and ask people stuff if they're willing. Sorry, guys.
Maybe we should go out.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, cool. We'll go out. Yeah, Kat is on the way out. Thank you.